All right, guys, a few things on international HR that I want you to know. I definitely want you to know the differences between offshoring and outsourcing. Offshoring is basically a type of outsourcing where we contract with companies overseas to do work for us. But outsourcing can also occur in the domestic market. So we might decide to have some of our accounting functions handled by an outside accounting firm that is located in our own state or our own country. That's still outsourcing, but it's not offshoring. So know the difference between those two. In terms of domestic, international, global, multinational, and transnational, I'm not going to ask you to know a ton about that for this HR class, but basically, if we are domestic, we only operate in our home country, and we only have to staff the home country, obviously. If we are in one of those other four categories, international, global, multinational, or transnational, it's possible that we will have overseas operations. Now, with an international focus, we might just find another company to do a joint venture with or a distributor overseas and not ever have an office of our own overseas. But with global, multinational, and transnational, particularly multinational and transnational companies, it's likely that we are going to have overseas locations that then we are going to have to staff. And so that's when the HR considerations really come into play. Your book talks about trade agreements, business environment. So the thing about the business environment that we need to know for HR is we would want to consider whether workers in the country that we are offshoring to or that we are creating a new subsidiary in have the expertise and skills and the education that they need to do the job. What is the economics of going there? Are we going to be able to pay them well, but also have lower or equivalent labor costs than just producing everything domestically? And what are the legal systems, and how is that going to affect our costs as well as how we administer programs? Because, for example, questions that we wouldn't ask in the U.S. because they might violate EEOC laws, we could ask in other countries. Other countries have kind of mandated bonuses or other benefits that the U.S. does not have, and so that also potentially increases costs. Your book talks about having a transnational HR strategy, which means looking at all of the countries in which we operate, all of their laws, all of their policies and economics, and coming up with overall policies that are going to be fair to all employees in all countries. Now, not every company takes this transnational stance, right? We might do things differently in different markets based on the local laws and procedures, but one thing that can sometimes be a source of conflict is something that we would consider illegal in our home country or certainly unethical might be legal in another country. So should we do it in that other country because we can, or if our belief is really that that's the wrong way to treat workers, shouldn't we use some of our domestic policies overseas so that it's fair to everyone, even if it's not illegal to do something different in that market? Your book also talks about culture. You may have seen Hofstede's Dimensions in OB before. Individualism, collectivism is something that might affect certainly the way we do rewards. It affects teams, things like that. So in the U.S., we're more individualistic. We have focus on ourselves and our own personal achievement and personal rewards. In a collectivist society, we're looking more about the good of the group or the collective, and group rewards might be more appropriate. Power distance might have to do with how decisions are made, how participative decision making is, whether empowerment is really going to happen. Uncertainty avoidance. Countries that are higher in uncertainty avoidance don't like not knowing what's going to happen, so there's more rules and safety regulations and procedures, and things like that. Long and short-term orientations might affect how much we plan for the future in terms of HR, how far out we're going to make plans. So basically the important thing to know is that culture varies globally, internationally, and that policies that are desirable in one culture might not go over so well in other cultures. This is just kind of the definition of culture and the way that we kind of can see culture, the language, the norms, the values, the rituals, and the artifacts here is labeled as material culture. Okay, then staffing. And generally, this doesn't mean the entire staff. Usually, this means managerial decisions. Are we going to get employees and managers from the local host country? Are we going to send people from our domestic offices, our home country, overseas to manage local employees? Or are we going to find managers from a completely different country and bring them in? So most often it's home country versus host country choice, but in a large multinational organization, an overseas assignment is often a prerequisite for moving up into higher managerial positions. So you might have a company that is home country is Korea, host country is the U.S., and they send someone from India to be a manager in the U.S. in this Korean company because their Indian subsidiary managers also need development. So there's pros and cons to using all three of those. Those are in your book. I would suggest you look them over, particularly home country versus host country, because that's usually the question. Should we pick someone who is, from this culture, make them the manager, or should we send someone from overseas? Traditionally, it would mostly be home country nationals who are the managers in these host countries. But a lot of that was because of the education level and expertise in those host countries. Today, a lot more countries are getting higher education either within their country or sending students to Britain, to the U.S., to another country with well-established universities that are well-respected, and you've got people within the host country that have MBAs, that have great experience, that maybe you don't need to send someone from the home country to work there. But if we're talking about a multinational corporation and we're talking about people that we potentially want to move up in the corporation, we want them to have some overseas experience and be familiar with these other cultures that they might be managing. There's pros and cons to both of those, and take a look at that. The other thing that has caused problems in the past that might be changing somewhat now is that if we send someone, for example, let's say home country is the U.S., we send a manager from the U.S. overseas to our subsidiary in Cambodia. That U.S. manager is going to want a similar style of living when they're in Cambodia. They might be bringing their family with them, so they're getting paid probably in U.S. dollars, a U.S. manager's salary. They usually have a house and a car provided for them. Their family has come. Their kids are probably being sent to an American school, and the company might be paying for that. So this home country national who is working in Cambodia, potentially with host country national managers as well, is probably being compensated a lot differently than those host country nationals are. The local Cambodian managers are probably not getting their houses or their cars paid for. They may not be getting as high a salary. So that can cause a lot of problems as well. How do we determine expatriate success? Well, number one, a lot of expatriates fail. So we want to look at a lot of different factors, and this is probably the better chart to be looking at. We want people with the right skills, right personality type, who are motivated and who know something about the culture or are willing to learn about the culture and know the language or are willing to learn the language. Now, note this column right here, family situation. That is really important. If we are sending a manager with a family overseas, we need that family on board. If it's a short assignment, the manager might be going without their family. We need the family to support that. If it's a long assignment, the family is probably going with the manager. And so we need to provide training for them as well, because if the family is unhappy, the manager, the expat's going to be unhappy, and they're likely going to come home early, which we would consider failure in this case, okay? So we talk a little bit here about the phases of adjustment. We go from excitement to frustration to okay, we're adapting, we're learning, and then we kind of accept both cultures. A lot of expats are never going to get to biculturalism, and that's why we have failure. We get stuck here in resistance, and we have people who go home. Okay? In terms of HR, how is the selection process different? Well, that nice chart before talked about some of the skills and personality characteristics that we might want in an expat. In terms of personality, openness to experience is probably a good one. Cultural intelligence, which is basically you know something about other cultures, you're willing to learn about other cultures, you're interested in other cultures, you're motivated to learn about other cultures, and you're kind of excited and interested about it, and you want to do well. Those types of people are going to do better in an international assignment. We also want to make sure that they know how to do the job that we're sending them to do. They have managerial competencies, they know a bit about the company, things like that. It is very expensive for an expat to fail. Not only because we've spent all this money to send them overseas, potentially their families overseas, providing them with all these perks usually, but if they do fail, they might decide to leave the company entirely, which means we've got the turnover situation. They might damage relationships that we've got with our local workers, and they might not do the best job there either. So the local subsidiary might not be, be as productive or performing as well as it could with a better manager. So we got a lot of costs there. So this has to be a really careful process of recruiting and selecting and figuring out what the best assignment for them is. As part of career development, we're kind of going to have a pool of applicants that we want to do overseas assignments and that are interested in it. So we have to match them up with the right assignment. Training is also really important. And again, it should be training for both the manager and probably their family members as well. Not as intensive for the family members, but we got to get them ready for it. And then when they come back, a lot of employees experience kind of a reverse culture shock where they adjusted so well to the other country that coming back home feels really weird. And so repatriation is getting them back to normal in the home country. It can be really expensive, but again, if they come home and they hate it so much that they decide to quit, we are again having big costs there. So that's something that we should be aware of. Okay, compensation. Do we pay everybody the same worldwide? Most companies don't do this, but it does make things simpler. Most are going to address cost of living is different in different places, laws are different in different places, and they do more of a localized compensation strategy where they have certain policies in place for the U.S. versus South America versus South Africa versus Asia. Again, when it comes to expats, it might not be desirable for a person from Japan to move to Peru where they're going to be making half of the salary and they're going to have to move back to Japan afterwards. So this is where the balance sheet approach comes in, where you make sure that the expat has the same standard of living that they would have had at home, and there may even be an overseas premium for them taking this job overseas. We also need to consider what are the benefits going to be like in the other countries. So do we have to pay higher taxes? Do we have to pay for health benefits? What are the required vacation days? The U.S. is really kind of behind vacation. A lot of places in the world, we don't have a mandated amount of vacation days, but the average number of days is 15. And that's for workers of all, have been working for various amounts of time. Most early, first-time employees are not going to be having 15 vacation days a year, but in a lot of countries, they're going to get weeks or months of time. So that's something to be aware of.